The elegant hum of Maison Grace was shattered by a sharp, derisive laugh. Victoria Stanford leaned back in her chair, her diamond earrings glinting under the soft glow of the chandeliers.
Did someone get lost on their way to the corner diner?
She said loudly, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward the restaurant's entrance. The target of her mockery? A black man dressed in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, his polished shoes catching the faintest light from the marble floor. He stood there, calm and composed, his eyes sweeping across the room. But, to Victoria, he was an eyesore, a glaring mismatch to the exclusivity of Maison Grace. "It's almost quaint," she sneered, glancing at her two companions for affirmation. "The audacity of some people." Her friends chuckled nervously, their laughter uneasy as they exchanged uncertain glances. The man didn't flinch. His quiet confidence was unnerving, a stark contrast to Victoria's escalating amusement. Her voice rang louder, slicing through the quiet murmur of diners.
"Maybe he's lost,"
she said with mock concern, her words dripping with sarcasm.
"Poor thing probably doesn't realize this isn't his kind of place."
For a moment, the restaurant stilled. Eyes turned to the man standing by the podium, and then to Victoria, her smug smile unwavering. But the staff didn't share her amusement. The hostess at the front straightened, her face flushed as she spoke quietly to the man. He nodded, unbothered by the weight of the room's judgment. Victoria rolled her eyes.
"I give it 2 minutes before they send him packing,"
she muttered, her voice just loud enough for the tables nearby to catch. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere began to shift. The manager of Maison Grace, a stately man with graying temples, hurried toward the entrance. His movements were brisk, his expression one of eager respect as he extended his hand.
"Mr. Grayson,"
he said warmly, loud enough for everyone to hear.
"We didn't expect you tonight. Please, allow me to escort you to your table."
Victoria's smirk faltered. Her companion stiffened. The name echoed in her mind like a warning bell. Mr. Grayson. Her stomach twisted, a sudden and uncomfortable realization beginning to take shape. Around her, the quiet conversations of other diners resumed. But for Victoria, the world narrowed to the man who now moved through the room with a quiet authority. As he passed her table, his gaze briefly met hers. There was no anger in his eyes, no hint of retaliation, just a calm, penetrating look that made her chest tighten. Victoria's breath hitched, and for the first time, her laughter faded. She had no idea who this man really was, but she was about to find out. And when she did, her world would tilt on its axis. Have you ever been in a moment like this? Maybe you've walked into a room and felt every pair of eyes judging you. Or perhaps you've seen someone dismissed unfairly just because of how they looked. Moments like these leave an imprint. They make you question the way the world works and how we treat each other. Victoria had no idea that the man she mocked carried a presence far greater than she could imagine. What would you do if you found yourself in her shoes, or perhaps in his? This story will challenge you to think, to feel, and maybe even to see the world a little differently. If this resonates with you, stay with us. The twists and turns of this tale will stay with you long after it's over. And while you're here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your story too. Let's dive into the heart of the story right now and uncover what happens next. The atmosphere inside Maison Grace was nothing short of mesmerizing. Soft jazz floated through the air, weaving effortlessly with the gentle murmur of conversations. The chandeliers, with their cascading crystals, reflected a warm, golden light that danced across the polished marble floors. Every detail of the restaurant spoke of elegance. White tablecloths perfectly pressed, glasses that gleamed under the glow, and the faint aroma of aged wine blending with freshly prepared delicacies. Maison Grace wasn't just a restaurant. It was an experience, a sanctuary for those who reveled in luxury. At the heart of this grandeur sat Victoria Stanford, her very presence radiating confidence and authority. Dressed in a tailored navy blue dress that hugged her frame perfectly, she exuded a sophistication that matched the opulence of her surroundings. Diamond earrings glinted against her smooth, swept-back hair as she casually sipped from her glass of Sauvignon Blanc. Victoria wasn't just another patron at Maison Grace. She was one of its key figures, a regional director overseeing multiple locations of the high-end restaurant chain. Tonight, however, she wasn't working. This was her time to relax, to indulge in the ambiance she helped cultivate. Seated with two of her closest friends, Amanda Prescott and Lauren Carter, Victoria seemed at ease. They were nestled at a table near the large bay window, where they could admire the bustling downtown skyline of Charleston. Their laughter, a symphony of refined amusement, mingled with the restaurant's background noise. For Victoria, moments like these were more than just leisure. They were affirmations of her status, a reminder of the life she had meticulously crafted. As Amanda complimented her recent trip to the Hamptons, Victoria tilted her head slightly, her signature smile forming. "Oh, it was divine," she said, her voice light but with an undertone of pride. "The estate we stayed at had the most exquisite garden, and the wine cellar, let's just say it made this place's selection look quaint." Lauren chuckled softly, raising her glass. "You're too much, Victoria," she said, though her eyes sparkled with admiration. Victoria thrived in these moments. She had a knack for commanding attention, for subtly steering conversations in ways that highlighted her achievements. Whether it was her career milestones, her exclusive vacations, or her designer wardrobe, she made sure the world knew she belonged at the top. As they continued to chat, Victoria's gaze swept across the restaurant. Her sharp eyes, trained to notice every detail, scanned the room. She had a habit of silently critiquing people, a game she played to amuse herself. Her smile tightened when she spotted a couple at a nearby table sharing a single dessert. "Not enough to afford two," she mused silently, suppressing a smirk. "That table over there," Victoria said, leaning toward her friends, her voice low but audible enough to spark their curiosity. "They're splitting one creme brulee. Adorable, isn't it?" Amanda glanced over briefly and then back at Victoria with a knowing smile. "Maybe they're watching their calories," she offered, trying to soften the remark. Victoria laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Or maybe they're just watching their wallets," she quipped, her tone tinged with amusement. Lauren hesitated, shifting slightly in her chair. While she enjoyed Victoria's wit, there were moments when it felt sharp, too sharp. Still, she smiled and took another sip of her wine, unwilling to disrupt the harmony of the evening. For Victoria, there was a peculiar satisfaction in these observations. She didn't see herself as cruel, just honest. In her world, appearances mattered, and people who didn't match the level of refinement she deemed acceptable were fair game for her casual critiques. She was the queen of her domain, unshaken, untouchable, or so she thought. Tonight was supposed to be like any other evening, a celebration of her success and the life she'd built. But just as she was about to launch into a story about her latest business deal, the soft chime of the restaurant's front door opening drew her attention. A man stepped inside, and the air seemed to shift ever so slightly. He was dressed plainly, in a crisp but modest button-up shirt and slacks. His shoes were polished but unassuming, lacking the designer flair Victoria had grown accustomed to noticing. He didn't wear a tie, nor did he exude the kind of wealth that usually graced Maison Grace. To Victoria, he looked out of place. Her eyebrows arched slightly as she exchanged a quick glance with Amanda and Lauren. "Now, this is interesting," she murmured, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. "Did someone forget to check the dress code at the door?" Amanda chuckled nervously, while Lauren kept her eyes fixed on her wine glass, the edges of discomfort creeping into her expression. Victoria's gaze remained fixed on the man as he stood near the entrance, scanning the room. He didn't appear flustered or unsure of himself. In fact, there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, but that only fueled Victoria's amusement. "It's almost cute, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Like a puppy wandering into a lion's den?" Amanda's laughter faltered slightly, and Lauren finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Maybe he's meeting someone here?" Victoria scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Meeting someone? Please. He looks like he should be meeting a job recruiter, not dining here." Her words, though spoken softly, carried an edge that cut through the ambiance like a blade. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing more. Victoria, oblivious to their discomfort, continued to revel in her assumptions. She leaned forward slightly, her diamond earrings catching the light, her smirk widening as she prepared to make another remark. Unbeknownst to her, the night had just taken a turn. The man she so casually dismissed wasn't just another diner. He was Marcus Grayson, and his quiet entrance would soon upend everything Victoria thought she knew about power, status, and respect. Marcus Grayson stepped inside Maison Grace, his presence seemingly at odds with the opulence around him. His attire was simple, an immaculately pressed button-up shirt, dark slacks, and polished shoes that caught the light just enough to hint at quiet attention to detail. There was no designer logo to flaunt, no flashy accessories to announce his arrival. Yet, despite his modest appearance, Marcus exuded an unshakable air of calm and confidence. His gaze moved steadily across the room, taking in the space with an observant precision. For a moment, the gentle buzz of the restaurant seemed to pause, as though the chandeliers above held their collective breath. Marcus had a way of commanding attention without demanding it, a presence that felt both quiet and unyielding. But for Victoria Stanford, seated at her table near the bay window, Marcus was an anomaly, an unwelcome one. Her sharp eyes landed on him, scanning his attire, his posture, his every detail. In her mind, he didn't belong. Not here, not at Maison Grace. The corners of her mouth curled into a smirk, and her voice, dripping with sarcasm, broke the delicate balance of the room. "Well," she said, loud enough for her friends, and perhaps Marcus, to hear, "I didn't realize Maison Grace had started hosting charity dinners." Amanda and Lauren exchanged quick glances, their expressions faltering as they caught the edge in Victoria's tone. Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Amanda let out a soft, awkward laugh, unsure of how to respond. Marcus, however, seemed unfazed. He stood near the hostess podium, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His composure remained unbroken, his face unreadable. Victoria, emboldened by his silence, leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier's glow. "Do you think he knows this isn't, what's the word, casual dining?" she mused, her voice carrying a practiced nonchalance that only sharpened the insult. Amanda forced a weak smile, stirring her drink as if to distract herself from the growing tension. "Maybe he's meeting someone important," she offered, her tone hesitant. Victoria scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through Amanda's attempt to diffuse the moment. "Meeting someone important?" she repeated, raising a perfectly arched brow. "Please, he looks like he wandered in off the street." Lauren's eyes darted toward Marcus, who remained standing at the entrance, exchanging a quiet word with the hostess. There was something about his demeanor that unsettled her, not in the way Victoria seemed to relish, but in a way that made her second-guess her friend's harsh words. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone," Lauren said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the rising pitch of Victoria's amusement. "Waiting for someone?" Victoria echoed, her tone laced with mock disbelief. "Unless it's for a fashion intervention, I doubt it." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a self-satisfied grin. "It's almost cute, really, like a lost puppy." Amanda's laugh was more strained this time, and Lauren looked down at her wine glass, avoiding Victoria's gaze altogether. While they often indulged in Victoria's sharp commentary, tonight it felt different. There was a tension in the air, a growing discomfort that neither of them could quite articulate. As Marcus stepped forward, the hostess gestured toward the dining area, her posture noticeably straighter, her tone slightly more formal. Marcus nodded in quiet acknowledgement, his movements deliberate, almost calculated. Victoria narrowed her eyes, the edges of her smirk faltering for the briefest moment. Something about the way the hostess spoke to him, an air of respect, almost reverence, didn't match the narrative Victoria had already written in her mind. "Odd," Victoria muttered, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the edge of the table. "You'd think someone like him would be redirected by now." Amanda's unease deepened, her smile fading entirely. "Maybe we should just let it go," she suggested softly. But Victoria wasn't listening. Her eyes followed Marcus as he walked deeper into the restaurant, his stride purposeful but unhurried. The staff, who moments earlier had been bustling around the room, now seemed to move with a certain attentiveness, their glances shifting toward Marcus as though awaiting his next move. Lauren cleared her throat, her voice low. "Victoria, I'm just saying," Victoria interrupted, her voice growing sharper. "There's a reason places like this have standards. It's not just about the food, it's about who you let in." As the words left her lips, a fleeting silence fell over the table. Amanda fidgeted with her napkin, and Lauren cast a quick, almost apologetic glance toward Marcus. But Victoria remained oblivious, too absorbed in her own sense of superiority to notice the unease radiating from her companions. Meanwhile, Marcus reached the far corner of the dining area, where the restaurant manager, an older man with a distinguished air, approached him with a warm, almost deferential smile. The two exchanged a firm handshake, the manager's voice carrying just enough for nearby diners to catch. "Mr. Grayson, it's an honor to have you here tonight." Victoria froze. Her smirk faltered, her confidence wavering as the name registered in her mind. Grayson. Her eyes narrowed, her thoughts scrambling to connect the dots. Amanda noticed the sudden change in Victoria's demeanor and leaned in cautiously. "Victoria, are you okay?" But Victoria didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on Marcus, her chest tightening as an uneasy realization began to take root. Around her, the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Lauren broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he might be someone important." Victoria's jaw tightened, her grip on the stem of her wine glass trembling ever so slightly. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she already knew. Victoria Stanford leaned forward, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation like a shard of glass. "I wonder," she began, her tone deliberately loud, "if he even knows what fork to use, or maybe he thinks this is buffet style." Her words, laced with mockery, elicited a nervous chuckle from Amanda, while Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. Across the room, Marcus Grayson appeared unbothered. He stood with an ease that defied the sharp edges of Victoria's words, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. His calm was almost unnerving, a silent resistance that made Victoria's taunts feel hollow in comparison. Still, she pressed on, unwilling to let his silence rob her of the spotlight. "You have to admire the confidence," she said, swirling her wine. "Walking in here like that, dressed like, well, I'm not sure what he's trying to prove. Maybe it's performance art." A few heads turned toward Victoria's table, diners casting brief, disapproving glances before returning to their meals. But Victoria didn't notice. Or, if she did, she didn't care. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, stirring her drink with the tip of her straw. "Maybe he's just, here for dinner," she offered weakly, hoping to steer the conversation away. Victoria's laugh was sharp and quick. "Here for dinner?" she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "At Maison Grace. Let's be honest, Amanda, people like him don't come here for dinner. They come here for spectacle." She waved her hand vaguely, as if the word itself carried the weight of her disdain. Lauren glanced at Marcus, her expression softening, as she noticed his steady gaze sweeping the room. He wasn't avoiding anyone's stare. If anything, he seemed to be studying the restaurant, each detail falling under his calm scrutiny. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no defensiveness, just an unshakable presence that made Lauren's discomfort with Victoria's words grow stronger. "Victoria, maybe you should," Lauren began, but Victoria cut her off with a dismissive wave. "What? Stop pointing out the obvious," Victoria said, her voice laced with feigned innocence. She leaned back in her chair, her smirk widening as Marcus began walking toward the center of the dining room. His strides were unhurried, his polished shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. The hostess followed a step behind him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. The entire room seemed to notice. Conversations quieted, forks hovered mid-air, and all eyes turned to Marcus. It was as if the very air had thickened, the weight of his presence impossible to ignore. Victoria's smirk faltered slightly, but she quickly masked it with another biting remark. "You'd think he'd at least have the decency to look embarrassed," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "But no, he's strutting around like he owns the place." Amanda's eyes darted nervously between Victoria and Marcus, her cheeks flushing. "I don't think anyone else is bothered," she said hesitantly, her words trailing off as Victoria shot her a look. "That's the problem, Amanda," Victoria replied, her tone icy. "People are too polite. Someone needs to set the standard." Marcus reached a table near the center of the room, pausing briefly as if surveying the space. A waiter approached him cautiously, their exchange quiet but respectful. Whatever Marcus said, it made the waiter nod quickly before hurrying away toward the kitchen. "Look at that," Victoria said, leaning forward again, sending the staff running already. What's next? Demanding a discount because he's underdressed? Lauren exhaled slowly, unable to meet Victoria's gaze. She watched as Marcus settled into a seat, his movements deliberate, almost graceful. Despite the palpable tension in the room, Marcus appeared entirely at ease, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the judgment radiating from Victoria's table. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Amanda fidgeted with her napkin, Lauren sipped her wine, and Victoria drummed her manicured nails against the edge of the table. But Marcus didn't glance their way. He didn't even acknowledge the weight of their stares. That, more than anything, seemed to irritate Victoria. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. He's just sitting there, like he belongs. Lauren finally spoke, her voice low but firm. Maybe he does belong. Victoria's head snapped toward her friend, her expression sharp. Excuse me? Lauren hesitated, her gaze flickering between Victoria and Marcus. I just mean, maybe we're the ones who don't see the full picture. Victoria laughed, a cold sound that drew a few more glances from nearby diners. The full picture, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Lauren, the picture is crystal clear, and trust me, it doesn't include him. But even as she spoke, Victoria couldn't shake the gnawing sensation creeping into her chest. Something about Marcus's unshaken calm, his quiet confidence, unsettled her. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, something Victoria couldn't define, but instinctively resented. Around the room, the hum of conversation began to pick up again, but the energy had shifted. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, and Marcus, seated in the middle of it all, seemed to hold the weight of the room without saying a word. Victoria's grip tightened on her wine glass, the edges of her smile straining. For the first time that evening, she felt a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the perfect facade she worked so hard to maintain. Victoria's gaze narrowed as she watched the waiter approach Marcus with a tray of sparkling water. It wasn't the delivery itself that caught her attention. It was the manner in which it was done. The waiter moved with an air of nervous precision, carefully placing the glass in front of Marcus and speaking to him in hushed, deferential tones. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, his expression calm yet commanding. "What is going on?" Victoria muttered under her breath, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. The quiet reverence of the staff unsettled her. She leaned toward Amanda and Lauren, her voice sharp and low. Since when do they treat someone like that with so much effort? Amanda, already uncomfortable with the direction of the evening, hesitated. Maybe he's a regular, she suggested, her tone soft, almost apologetic. Victoria scoffed, her laugh cold and brittle. A regular? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. Please, Amanda. Regulars here drive cars that cost more than his entire outfit. They don't walk in looking like he just left a discount department store. Lauren, who had been watching the interaction with increasing unease, shifted in her seat. He doesn't seem fazed, she said quietly, her eyes on Marcus. It's like he knows something we don't. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her growing irritation. Knows what? How to play the part of the misunderstood underdog? Spare me. But even as she spoke, her confidence wavered. Across the room, Marcus sat with an ease that contradicted everything Victoria assumed about him. He wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't trying to impress. He simply existed, commanding respect without uttering a word. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. One by one, staff members seemed to take notice of Marcus, their glances lingering just a little longer, their movements around his table more deliberate. When another waiter arrived with a complimentary bread basket, a gesture reserved only for the most valued guests, Victoria's grip on her glass tightened. "What is going on?" she whispered fiercely, her frustration bubbling to the surface. She glanced around, searching for some explanation, but the other diners seemed unfazed, content to enjoy their meals. Then, as if on cue, the restaurant manager appeared. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that matched the elegance of Maison Grace. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he made his way toward Marcus. Victoria's eyes followed him, her curiosity and irritation intertwining into a knot in her chest. When the manager reached Marcus's table, his posture changed. He extended his hand, his smile warm and sincere. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "It's an honor to have you with us tonight. Welcome back." Victoria froze. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of disbelief. "Mr. Grayson?" she whispered to herself, her mind racing. The name sounded important, weighty. But why? Amanda and Lauren exchanged uneasy glances, their silence speaking volumes. Amanda leaned closer to Victoria, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know who he is?" "No," Victoria snapped, though her uncertainty was palpable. She turned back to Marcus, who was now engaged in a quiet conversation with the manager. The two men spoke with an ease that suggested familiarity, respect. As the manager gestured toward one of the private dining areas, Victoria's stomach twisted. Marcus stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with deliberate precision. There was nothing rushed or apologetic about his movements. He carried himself with the kind of assurance Victoria only associated with people who had nothing to prove and everything to command. The manager led Marcus toward the VIP section, the staff parting like waves to make way. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest, her earlier confidence unraveling with each step Marcus took. "VIP," she hissed, her voice breaking the silence at their table. Why would someone like him be seated in VIP? Lauren's gaze flickered toward Victoria, her voice hesitant. "Maybe he's someone important." Victoria's laugh was bitter, forced. Important? Him? But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The pieces didn't fit, and for the first time, she couldn't manipulate the narrative to her advantage. Across the room, Marcus settled into the private dining area, his composure as steady as ever. The manager lingered briefly, ensuring every detail of the table was perfect before excusing himself. Victoria's mind raced, a cacophony of questions and insecurities swirling in her thoughts. Who was this man? Why was he being treated with such reverence? And most unsettling of all, what did it mean for her? Her companions remained silent, their discomfort growing with each passing moment. Amanda sipped her drink, avoiding eye contact, while Lauren's gaze darted between Marcus and Victoria, as if waiting for the next explosion. But Victoria couldn't let it go. Her world, so carefully curated, so tightly controlled, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and demanding. "I want to know what's going on." Amanda hesitated, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we shouldn't—" "No," Victoria interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Something about this doesn't add up." Her eyes remained locked on Marcus, who now sat quietly in the VIP section, seemingly oblivious to the storm he had ignited. But deep down, Victoria knew he wasn't oblivious. He was deliberate, intentional, and that scared her more than she cared to admit. Victoria's polished exterior began to crack as she stared across the room at Marcus, seated in the VIP section like he had every right to be there. Her mind buzzed with unanswered questions, each one louder and more demanding than the last. Who was he? Why was he being treated with such deference? And why was no one explaining anything? She leaned forward, her elbows pressing into the white tablecloth, her fingers gripping the edge of her wine glass. Her voice was sharp as she addressed the waiter who had just arrived to check on their table. "Excuse me," she said, her tone teetering between authority and irritation. "That man," she gestured subtly toward Marcus. "Why is he being seated in VIP? Does he have a reservation?" The waiter hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to where Marcus sat. "I'm not sure, ma'am," he said carefully, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Perhaps you could ask the manager." Victoria's frustration bubbled over, but she forced a tight smile. "Of course," she replied, her words clipped. As the waiter retreated, she turned back to Amanda and Lauren, her agitation impossible to hide. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice low but intense. "How can no one have an answer? They're treating him like royalty, and for what? He doesn't belong here." Lauren, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Maybe it's not our business, Victoria," she said softly. "Does it really matter?" "Of course it matters," Victoria snapped, her composure slipping further. "This is Maison Grace. It's about standards. If they start letting anyone—" She stopped herself, realizing how her words sounded, but it was too late. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, her eyes fixed on the table. "I don't think he's just anyone, Victoria," she said quietly, glancing toward Marcus. He doesn't look out of place. If anything, he looks like he knows exactly where he's meant to be. The comment stung more than Victoria cared to admit. She straightened in her chair, her jaw tightening. "He's just putting on a show," she said dismissively, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Across the room, Marcus sat with the same quiet composure he'd carried since walking through the door. A waiter approached him with a dish that wasn't on the menu, placing it in front of him with careful precision. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, his expression calm but unreadable. Victoria's curiosity burned brighter. "What did they just serve him?" she whispered, half to herself. "That's not on the regular menu." Her thoughts raced. She had spent years climbing the ranks at Maison Grace, earning her position as regional director through meticulous attention to detail and a carefully crafted image of perfection. She knew the restaurant's clientele inside and out, the regulars, the VIPs, the influencers who came for the ambiance. But Marcus? He didn't fit into any of those categories, and it infuriated her. She flagged down another staff member, this time a young woman who looked barely out of college. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice firm. "I have a question about that man seated in VIP." The young woman's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced nervously toward Marcus's table. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quickly. "I'm not at liberty to discuss our guests." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not at liberty?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I'm a regional director for Maison Grace. If anyone should know, it's me." The young woman faltered, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. I'm sorry," she stammered before quickly retreating. Victoria's frustration boiled over. She turned back to Amanda and Lauren, her face flushed. "Can you believe this?" she demanded. "They're hiding something." Amanda glanced at Lauren, her unease mirrored in her friend's expression. "Victoria," Amanda began cautiously, "maybe you're reading too much into this." "Am I?" Victoria shot back, her voice sharp. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they're bending over backward for a man who doesn't even meet the dress code." But even as she said it, Victoria couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. Something wasn't adding up, and the more she tried to rationalize it, the more it gnawed at her. The tension in the restaurant was palpable now, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Marcus remained the center of it all, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing at Victoria's table. When the manager returned to Marcus's table, carrying a bottle of vintage wine that Victoria knew wasn't listed on the menu, she felt her stomach twist. The manager poured the wine himself, speaking to Marcus in low, respectful tones. Whatever Marcus said in response made the manager nod and smile, his body language radiating deference. Victoria couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going over there," she announced, standing abruptly and nearly knocking her chair over. "Victoria, no!" Lauren hissed, grabbing her arm. "Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Victoria shot back, shaking Lauren off. "I'm getting answers." She smoothed the front of her dress, took a deep breath, and began walking toward Marcus's table, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The eyes of nearby diners followed her, their curiosity piqued by the sudden movement. As Victoria approached, Marcus looked up, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity that made her steps falter for a split second. But she recovered quickly, planting a practiced smile on her face. "Excuse me," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice the attention you've been receiving tonight. I'm curious, what brings you to Maison Grace?" Marcus set down his glass, his movements deliberate and measured. He regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable, the pause stretched, the silence heavy. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Dinner." Victoria blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his answer. "Dinner," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "That's it?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Is there something wrong with that?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She felt the weight of his stare, a calm power that left her flustered in a way she couldn't explain. The manager, who had been observing from a distance, quickly approached. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. Victoria forced a smile, her composure slipping further. "Of course," she said quickly. "I was just introducing myself." The manager nodded, though his attention was firmly on Marcus. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his tone respectful. "If there's anything you need, Please don't hesitate to let us know." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, that name, spoken with a reverence she couldn't ignore. "Thank you," Marcus replied simply, his focus never leaving Victoria. As the manager excused himself, Victoria felt the eyes of the restaurant on her, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her chest. She forced another smile, nodded stiffly, and turned back toward her table, her thoughts racing. Who was Marcus Grayson? The room seemed to hum with an unspoken tension as the restaurant manager stepped forward, clearing his throat. Every head turned toward him, including Victoria's, her expression frozen in a mixture of curiosity and impatience. She straightened in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth as though bracing herself for an answer she both demanded and dreaded. "Ladies and gentlemen," the manager began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something significant. He glanced briefly at Marcus, who offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It is with great honor that I introduce Mr. Marcus Grayson, the new owner of Maison Grace." The words hit Victoria like a freight train. Her breath caught, her carefully composed expression shattering into disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Amanda and Lauren sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide as they exchanged incredulous glances. Around them, a murmur rippled through the room as diners reacted, some with surprise, others with polite applause. But for Victoria, the sound was drowned out by the roaring in her ears. The new owner, the man she had ridiculed, dismissed, and openly mocked. He was the owner of Maison Grace? "No," Victoria muttered, shaking her head as though the act could undo the truth. That can't be right." But it was right, and the confirmation was written in every gesture, every deferential glance cast Marcus's way by the staff. Even the manager's posture, slightly bowed as he addressed Marcus, spoke volumes. Victoria's mind raced, scrambling to make sense of the situation. How could she not have known? She prided herself on being in control, on anticipating every detail. Yet here she was, blindsided in the most humiliating way possible. Across the room, Marcus remained seated, his expression calm but commanding. He didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge the stunned reactions around him. Instead, he simply thanked the manager with a quiet dignity that made Victoria's stomach churn. "Impossible," she muttered under her breath, her hands trembling as she reached for her wine glass. She took a sip, the liquid bitter against her dry throat. Lauren, ever the voice of reason, leaned closer to Victoria. "Maybe we should leave," she suggested softly, her tone cautious. "This is a lot?" "No," Victoria snapped, her voice sharper than intended. She placed the glass down with a trembling hand, glaring at Marcus as though her anger could pierce his composure. "I'm not going anywhere." Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Victoria," she began hesitantly, "you've been saying things. Maybe it's best if we—" "I said, I'm not leaving," Victoria interrupted, her voice low and steely. "He doesn't scare me." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of his presence pressing down on her, suffocating in its quiet power. Marcus didn't need to say a word. His silence was more devastating than any retort. The manager returned to Marcus's table, his movements deliberate as he spoke with the waitstaff. Plates were replaced with fresh dishes, the service seamless and precise. It was clear now, this wasn't just respect, it was reverence. Victoria's chest tightened as the reality of her situation sank in. She had laughed at him, belittled him in front of her friends and the other diners. And now, every word she'd spoken felt like a noose tightening around her pride. Unable to contain herself any longer, Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound drew the attention of nearby tables, but she didn't care. She marched toward Marcus's table, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. As she approached, Marcus looked up, his gaze meeting hers with a calm intensity that stopped her in her tracks. For a moment, she faltered, the words she'd rehearsed in her mind evaporating under the weight of his stare. I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "If I had known—" Marcus raised a hand, his movement slow but decisive. "You would have treated me differently?" he asked, his voice steady and unyielding. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, her face flushing. She had no answer, at least not one she was willing to admit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Your assumptions say more about you than they do about me, he said quietly, his words cutting through her like a blade. Victoria's chest heaved as she struggled to find her footing. I wasn't trying to mock me, Marcus interrupted, his tone still calm, but with an edge that made her throat tighten. No, of course not. You were just being honest. The echo of her own words, spoken so smugly earlier in the evening, hit her like a slap. She glanced around, noticing the curious eyes of other diners. The room felt unbearably small, the walls closing in as the weight of her actions settled over her. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. Marcus regarded her for a long moment, his gaze steady but unyielding. Finally, he nodded, his expression softening just enough to let her breathe. Apologies are a start, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But actions speak louder. Victoria swallowed hard, nodding slowly as she stepped back. She turned on her heel, retreating to her table with trembling legs. Her friends avoided her gaze, their discomfort palpable as she sank into her chair. For the first time that evening, Victoria felt powerless, and in that powerlessness, she began to understand the depth of her mistake. Victoria sat frozen at the table, the glass of wine in her hand trembling slightly. The weight of Marcus's calm words, his presence, felt suffocating. Around her, the murmurs of the restaurant continued, but all she could hear was the echo of her own biting remarks from earlier. What was I thinking, she thought, her mind spinning. Every cruel word, every dismissive laugh she had directed toward Marcus, now replayed in her head like a cruel symphony of her own making. But she couldn't just let it end like this. She was Victoria Stanford, the regional director of Amazing Grace, a woman who always controlled the narrative. Taking a deep breath, she stood, her legs unsteady, but her resolve firm. I can fix this, she muttered under her breath, brushing off Amanda's quiet plea to let it go. As she approached Marcus's table, her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the vulnerability she loathed to feel. He looked up at her as she neared, his expression calm but unreadable. Mr. Grayson, Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly before she steadied it. I just wanted to apologize. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. Apologize? He repeated, his tone neutral. Victoria swallowed hard. Yes, for earlier. I didn't mean to mock me? Marcus asked quietly, cutting her off with a precision that made her flinch. I didn't realize who you were, Victoria blurted out, her words tumbling over themselves in her haste to explain. If I had known, Marcus leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor never wavering. If you had known I was the owner, he said, his voice steady but firm, you would have treated me differently? The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. For the first time, Victoria felt truly exposed, the cracks in her carefully curated persona laid bare. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to drive the point home. Tell me, he continued, his voice soft but cutting, if I were just another guest, someone you thought didn't belong, would you be standing here right now? Victoria's breath caught. Her mind scrambled for an answer, for something, anything that could absolve her. But the truth loomed large, undeniable. She wouldn't have treated him with respect. She wouldn't have apologized. She wouldn't have given him a second thought. She stammered, her voice faltering. I didn't mean... Marcus held up a hand, silencing her. You didn't mean for me to hear it, he said plainly. That's the truth, isn't it? Victoria felt her cheeks burn as the weight of his words settled over her. Around them, the quiet hum of the restaurant seemed to fade, leaving only the tension between them. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, leaning forward slightly, he spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. An apology is easy when you've been caught, he said. But what about accountability, Ms. Stanford? What about recognizing the harm you caused? Not just to me, but to everyone who's had to endure those same assumptions, those same dismissive words. Victoria blinked, his words cutting deeper than she expected. She had spent her career climbing the corporate ladder, priding herself on her ability to navigate social hierarchies with ease. But now, faced with Marcus's quiet power, she felt small, exposed, and utterly out of her depth. I didn't think, she began, but Marcus interrupted her again. No, he said sharply, his calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. You did think. You made a judgment the moment you saw me. You decided I didn't belong, and you enjoyed it. That's the part you don't want to admit. Victoria's chest tightened, his words hitting their mark with painful precision. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Marcus leaned back, the calm returning to his voice. Do you know what it feels like? He asked quietly, his tone softer now, but no less impactful. To walk into a room and be judged before you've spoken a word? To have someone decide your worth based on nothing but their own assumptions? Victoria's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but she couldn't. Because she did know. Deep down, she knew exactly what Marcus was describing, because she had been the one doing it for so long. I didn't think it mattered, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus regarded her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. And now? He asked simply. Victoria exhaled shakily, her hands trembling at her sides. Now? I see it, she said, her voice breaking. I see what I did, and I'm ashamed. For the first time, Marcus's expression softened, just slightly. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. Good, he said quietly. Shame is a start, but it's not enough. Victoria looked up, her eyes searching his. What do I do? She asked, her voice raw. Marcus held her gaze, his voice calm but firm. You learn, he said. You take this moment and you grow from it. And the next time you meet someone you think doesn't belong, you treat them with respect. Because that's what matters, not who I am, but who you are. Victoria nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt the cracks in her foundation, not as something to be feared, but as a chance to rebuild. As she turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped her. Ms. Stanford, he said, his tone lighter now, but still steady. Remember, true power isn't about looking down on others. It's about lifting them up. Victoria paused, his words lingering in the air like a challenge. She nodded once more before returning to her table, her steps slower, her head lower. For the rest of the evening, she sat in silence, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background, as she reflected on the painful truth Marcus had forced her to confront. It wasn't just about him, it was about her and the person she wanted to become. The night at Maison Grace ended, but its echoes followed Victoria like a shadow. As the last diners filtered out and the hum of conversation faded, she sat in her chair, staring at the untouched dessert in front of her. Amanda and Lauren exchanged glances, neither daring to break the heavy silence that hung over their table. Victoria, Amanda began hesitantly, her voice soft. Maybe we should call it a night. Victoria didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was distant, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For once, the sharp confidence that usually defined her was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability she couldn't hide. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would be like this. Lauren frowned, leaning in slightly. What do you mean? Victoria shook her head, her fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth. I didn't think he would be someone like that, she admitted, her voice trembling. Someone important. Amanda shifted uncomfortably. Does it matter who he is? She asked, her tone careful but firm. I mean, the way you treated him. That's not about his title, Victoria. That's about you. The word stung more than Victoria cared to admit. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but the truth settled in her chest like a stone. Amanda was right. The ride home was quiet. Victoria stared out the window, the city lights blurring as her thoughts raced. Every word Marcus had spoken replayed in her mind, sharp and unrelenting. Your assumptions say more about you than they do about me. The next morning, Victoria awoke with a lingering heaviness in her chest. She sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous night felt like a bad dream, but the sinking feeling in her stomach reminded her it was all too real. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to forget the whole ordeal, to bury it under the weight of her responsibilities and move on. But something inside her, something she couldn't ignore, urged her to face it. Typing Marcus Grayson into the search bar, Victoria hit enter and watched as the results populated. The first article caught her eye. Marcus Grayson, the visionary behind Maison Grace's new era. Her eyes scanned the text, each line unraveling a story she hadn't expected. Marcus wasn't just the new owner of Maison Grace. He was a celebrated entrepreneur, known for his innovative approach to business and his unwavering commitment to community development. The article detailed his rise from humble beginnings, describing a young man who had faced more obstacles than most could imagine. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood, Marcus had worked tirelessly to build a career in hospitality, using his success to create opportunities for others. He had funded scholarships, supported small businesses, and launched programs aimed at empowering underprivileged communities. Victoria leaned back in her chair, the words blurring as her eyes filled with tears she hadn't realized were coming. This wasn't just about Marcus's success. It was about the kind of person he was. A man who had every reason to be bitter, yet chose to lead with kindness and integrity. She thought of the way he had spoken to her, calm yet firm, his words cutting straight to the heart of her arrogance. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't sought to humiliate her, even though he could have. Instead, he had simply held up a mirror, forcing her to confront a version of herself she wasn't proud of. The memory of his question echoed in her mind. If I weren't the owner, would you still be apologizing? The rest of the day passed in a haze of self-reflection. Victoria couldn't focus on her usual tasks. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. For years, she had built her career and her identity on the belief that success was about appearances, about maintaining an image of control and superiority. But now, for the first time, she questioned everything. That evening, she found herself scrolling through more articles about Marcus. Photos accompanied the stories. Marcus speaking at a charity event, shaking hands with students at a scholarship ceremony, smiling warmly with a group of employees at a restaurant opening. One image, in particular, caught her attention. It was a candid shot of Marcus in a small community center, sitting at a table surrounded by children. His sleeves were rolled up, his posture relaxed, and his smile genuine. The caption read, "Marcus Grayson visits local youth program funded by his foundation." Victoria stared at the image, her chest tightening. She had spent so much time judging Marcus, assuming she knew who he was based on nothing but his appearance. Yet here he was, a man who had built more than a successful business. He had built a legacy of kindness and inclusion. By the time night fell, Victoria felt a determination she hadn't experienced in years. She couldn't undo what she had said, couldn't erase the way she had treated Marcus, but she could do something else. She could change. Opening her laptop, she began drafting an email. The words didn't come easily. At first, apologies never did. But as she wrote, she let go of her pride, allowing her honesty to guide her. "Dear Mr. Grayson," she began, "I don't know if you'll even read this, but I need to say it anyway. Last night, I acted in a way that I'm deeply ashamed of. I judged you unfairly, and in doing so, I disrespected not only you, but the values I claim to stand for. Your words have stayed with me, and they've forced me to confront a side of myself I've been avoiding for far too long. I see now how wrong I was, not just last night, but in the assumptions I've carried for years. I want to thank you for your patience and for challenging me to be better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm committed to learning from this experience. I hope one day, through my actions, I can prove that I've taken your words to heart." She read the email twice before hitting send, her heart pounding as she watched it disappear into the void. For the first time in a long time, Victoria felt the stirrings of something new, a humility that came not from humiliation, but from growth. Victoria sat in her car outside the community center, her fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. The invitation email from Marcus's foundation sat open on her phone screen, the bold letters at the top reading, "Volunteer Orientation. Empowering communities through action." She had hesitated before signing up, unsure if she would even be welcome after everything that had happened. But something inside her, a quiet but persistent voice, urged her to take this step. The entrance to the community center was simple, unassuming, a stark contrast to the luxury and opulence of Maison Grace. Yet, as Victoria stepped inside, she was greeted by an energy that felt warm and inviting. Volunteers of all ages bustled about, setting up tables, arranging supplies, and chatting with a genuine ease that Victoria hadn't seen in her usual social circles. A young woman at the check-in table smiled as Victoria approached. "Welcome. Are you here to volunteer?" Victoria nodded, her throat dry as she forced a small smile. "Yes, I thought I'd help out where I can." The woman handed her a name tag and gestured toward a group assembling chairs in a corner. "Feel free to join them. They're planning the next workshop." Victoria moved toward the group, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She had chosen a simpler outfit today, nothing flashy, just comfortable slacks and a blouse. It felt strange to forego her usual armor of designer brands, but somehow, she felt more herself this way. As she joined the group, a tall man with a clipboard turned to greet her. "Hi there," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Darren, one of the coordinators. Thanks for coming." "Victoria," she replied, shaking his hand. Darren's friendly demeanor put her at ease, and within minutes she found herself folding chairs and discussing ideas for the upcoming leadership workshop. The conversation flowed naturally, the focus shifting between logistics and personal anecdotes. At first, Victoria remained quiet, unsure of how to contribute, but as the group discussed ways to engage the local youth, she found herself chiming in. "What about using role-playing scenarios?" she suggested. "It could help them practice leadership skills in real-world situations." Darren nodded thoughtfully. "That's a great idea. Let's add it to the list." For the first time in a long while, Victoria felt her voice mattered not because of her title or status, but because of her ideas. Later that afternoon, as the volunteers gathered for a break, Victoria found herself sitting next to a young woman named Sarah, a college student who had been part of Marcus's scholarship program. "Marcus's foundation changed my life," Sarah said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without him. He doesn't just give people opportunities, he believes in them." Victoria listened intently, a knot forming in her chest. She thought about the man she had mocked so easily, the man who had endured her scorn with grace. "He's remarkable," Victoria said softly, her voice laced with admiration. Sarah nodded. "He is, but what's really amazing is how much he cares. He doesn't just throw money at problems. He's here. He listens." Victoria's gaze drifted across the room to where Marcus stood, engaged in conversation with a group of volunteers. His sleeves were rolled up, his posture relaxed, and his smile genuine. He wasn't the untouchable figure she had assumed he would be. He was present, approachable, human. By the end of the day, Victoria felt a quiet sense of accomplishment as she helped pack up the materials. She had spent hours working alongside people she would have overlooked in her old life, and for the first time, she felt connected to something bigger than herself. As she gathered her things to leave, Marcus approached her, his expression calm but kind. "Ms. Stanford," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't expect to see you here." Victoria felt her cheeks flush. "I thought it was time to give back," she said awkwardly. Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding. "It's a good start," he said simply. "Keep showing up. That's what matters." Victoria nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I will," she promised. As she walked to her car, the evening air cool against her skin, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that she could change, that she could become someone worthy of the respect she so desperately sought. Weeks turned into months, and Victoria Stanford was no longer the woman who had once strutted through Maison Grace with an air of superiority. Her life, once centered around status and appearances, now revolved around something much deeper, a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Victoria began to attend every event Marcus's foundation hosted, from youth leadership workshops to food drives and community forums. At first, she participated cautiously, unsure of how others would perceive her. But as time went on, her hesitations faded. She became a regular face among the volunteers, greeting people warmly and lending a hand wherever it was needed. Her colleagues at Maison Grace were the first to notice the change. Gone was the sharp-tongued director who prided herself on being untouchable. In her place was someone more approachable, someone who took time to listen and offer genuine encouragement. One morning, as Victoria helped organize supplies for a scholarship fundraiser, Marcus approached her. His presence, as always, commanded attention. But Victoria no longer felt the intimidation she once did. "You've been busy," Marcus said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. Victoria looked up, smiling. "There's a lot to do," she replied. And honestly, I enjoy it. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. Why? He asked simply. Victoria paused, considering the question. Because it feels real, she said after a moment. For so long, I thought success was about how others saw me, but now, it's about what I can do for others. I want to build something that lasts, something that matters. Marcus studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but warm. That's a good answer, he said finally, and it's a good path to be on. His words, simple as they were, stayed with her. Victoria's transformation didn't happen overnight, and there were moments when her old habits crept back in, moments of impatience, flashes of judgment. But each time, she caught herself and remembered Marcus's calm words. Keep showing up. She started mentoring young women who were beginning their careers, sharing her experiences with a humility she hadn't known she possessed. She spoke openly about her mistakes, her struggles with pride, and the lessons she had learned. One of her mentees, a shy but ambitious college graduate named Emily, approached her after a session. Ms. Stanford, Emily said nervously, I just wanted to say, your story really inspired me. It's easy to feel like we have to be perfect all the time, but hearing how you've grown, it gives me hope. Victoria felt a lump rise in her throat as she smiled at Emily. Thank you, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. By the time Maison Grace hosted its annual gala, Victoria had fully embraced her new outlook on life. She stood at the entrance, greeting guests not as the untouchable regional director, but as a member of the community. When Marcus arrived, she greeted him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Thank you for everything, she said sincerely. Marcus raised an eyebrow, a subtle smile playing on his lips. For what? For giving me the chance to see things differently, Victoria replied. Marcus nodded. You gave yourself that chance, he said. I just asked the question. As the evening unfolded, Victoria moved through the room with a quiet confidence that no longer relied on status or approval. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to contribute. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the community center. As Victoria stood near the registration table, her hands deftly organizing the day's paperwork, her once pristine designer aesthetic had softened into practicality. Simple flats, a comfortable blouse, and a sense of purpose that radiated more than any luxury brand ever could. Across the room, Marcus watched her with a quiet sense of pride. She had become an integral part of the team, not through grand gestures, but by showing up every day with sincerity and dedication. She worked tirelessly, her energy focused on making each project as impactful as possible. During a break, Victoria approached Marcus, handing him a list of ideas for an upcoming event. I think these could help with outreach, she said, her tone confident yet collaborative. Marcus glanced over the list, then looked back at her. You've been putting in the work, he said simply. Victoria smiled, her voice softer. Because I finally understand what it's for. It's not about me, it's about everyone we're helping. By the afternoon, Victoria found herself guiding a group of young volunteers through an activity station. A teenage girl hesitated before approaching her, clutching a folder. Ms. Victoria, the girl began nervously. Can you help me with this? I'm applying for a leadership scholarship. Victoria knelt beside her, smiling warmly. Of course, she said, gently flipping through the girl's application. Together, they worked through each section, Victoria offering encouragement and advice along the way. Moments like these reminded her of the real meaning of success, not status, but service. She no longer saw these tasks as obligations, but as opportunities to connect and uplift. As the event concluded, Marcus gathered the team to reflect on their progress. His voice, steady and assured, carried through the room. Today was another step forward, he said. But remember, this work is about consistency. It's about showing up every day with the same commitment. Victoria nodded, the weight of his words settling deeply. She had come to understand that transformation wasn't about grand declarations, but about the quiet, persistent choice to keep growing. Walking out of the center as the sun dipped below the horizon, Victoria felt a rare sense of peace. She wasn't chasing approval or status anymore, she was chasing purpose. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Upcoming volunteer opportunities. She smiled, already planning her next steps. The journey wasn't over, and that was the beauty of it. Victoria had found a new beginning, and with it, a chance to keep learning, contributing, and becoming the person she aspired to be. As Victoria's journey reminds us, change is never easy, but it's always possible. This story highlights the importance of humility, the courage to confront our own biases, and the strength it takes to grow from our mistakes. Victoria's transformation didn't just impact her, it showed us all the power of empathy and the value of lifting others up instead of judging them. So, now we turn the conversation to you. Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to rethink your assumptions about someone? How did it change your perspective? Or perhaps you've been in Marcus's shoes, staying calm and composed in the face of judgment. What did that teach you about yourself? We'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, your reflections, so please share them in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going, because every perspective matters, and together we can learn from one another. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next heartwarming story that inspires, challenges, and moves you.